Hello and welcome. My name's Graham Craven. I'm the Member Pioneer Coordinator for Cardiff, the Vale of Glamorgan and the Lower Valleys. This meeting came about because we as a team in Cardiff and the surrounds were disappointed that COVID ruined our chance to meet those involved with Fairtrade in person. So we decided we'd try for the next best thing, and as seems to be the standard at the moment, we went for a virtual meeting. So thank you for attending. And it's fantastic that so many of you have chosen to spend a part of your afternoon with us today. I'm obviously delighted to welcome you to the meeting along with Mike Gidney, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Fairtrade Foundation, who's going to speak to us on climate justice. And I'll introduce Mike properly in a moment. Mike, as I've already said, most of us here today work for the co-op in some shape or form, which has a long and proud history with fair trade. But we've also got people here, hopefully from the public sector, charities and other private sector organisations. We're all here as part of Fairtrade's Foundation's Choose the World You Want festival, a chance to shine the spotlight on climate crisis and what it means for people who produce the things we love to eat and drink. For more than 25 years, farmers and workers have been the fundamental reason why fair trade exists. Too many farmers are still struggling to put food on the table in a global trading system that is still balanced in favour of the powerful few. But now, not only are their livelihoods under threat, so too is the food we all love. Take chocolate, for example. West Africa produces more than half the world's cocoa, but as temperatures rise, many of those will simply be too hot to grow cocoa or coffee. And it's estimated that by 50% of the land currently used for cocoa and coffee production will be lost. We obviously can't allow that situation to continue, but while it does, farmers struggling to earn enough can't realistically look beyond their day-to-day needs to take action against the growing climate emergency. That was the view that was echoed by Father John Joseph last week, a fair trade producer in India who spoke to us about what it's like to be a fair trade farmer and the challenges that they face, including attacks from tigers and marauding monkeys. As someone wrote in the chat box last week, our farmers have it easy in comparison. Now, we all know that the last 12 months has been a year like no other. Every one of us has struggled in some way to adjust to life during a global pandemic. On top of an existing environmental crisis, Fairtrade is already seeing the impact that COVID is having on farming communities. But as well as the hardships of last year, we've also seen what can happen when communities come together to fight for change. Millions have just been inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement, and millions continue to demand climate justice at demonstrations around the world. We need justice for our people and our planet. Sometimes we can feel powerless to affect change, but look at the last year we've lived through. Look at what's possible when we work together, even in the darkest of times. As we were reminded at last week's meeting, I think it was Deb Wozencraft that said it, reminded us that St. David, patron saint of Wales, said, "Do the little things, as they can make a big difference if they're done with the right heart." So one of the little things we can all do is to choose fair trade. So on that note, let me introduce Mike properly. Mike has worked in international development for 30 years, with a particular focus on fighting poverty through trade. He joined the Fairtrade Foundation in 2009 as Deputy Executive Director before becoming Chief Executive in 2012. I hope that's all right, Mike. And I'll hand over to you now.
Lovely, thank you, Graham. And hello, everybody. It's really good to see you. And as Graham said, thank you for giving up some of your lunch hour or your afternoon to talk about fair trade. It's particularly good for me to be able to talk to you because so many of you are involved with the co-op and the cooperative movement. And I think this last 12 months, as much as it's been, so tough for all of us really, all over the world, there are little bursts of, silver lining, and the cooperative movement is one of them. for me. That sort of basic principle of cooperation is. It just seems to have sort of come to the fore in ways that perhaps we might never have imagined it would do. So you think about going back to this time last year and the start of the pandemic, and then that first lockdown, and how we were all as a society sort of struggling to make sense of it. And one of the things that started to come out really clearly was just how interdependent we are. How much we really rely on each other. And I know that sounds obvious, and it certainly sounds obvious to those of you in the cooperative movement, but it's perhaps something which society had slightly taken for granted. And whether it's clapping for carers or neighbours looking after each other, and food parcels and delivery mechanisms and support bubbles, that whole concept of a support bubble, that's just community. In a microcosm, and the sense that society will only really function and only really withstand the kind of awful shock of something like COVID if we cooperate. It's as I say to you, many of you, I'm sure it's obvious. Perhaps as a global system, the geopolitics, we'd forgotten that somehow, and that gives me real heart. And I think what the co-op has done in the UK has been absolutely extraordinary. We've seen lots of retailers go the extra mile and work on the logistics of delivery to get food and supplies into sort of stock shelves. But I think the co-op, as a retail business, but as a community-based movement as well, has just been outstanding in looking after people here and people there. So at the same time as dealing with those kind of impossible commercial logistics of making sure that shelves are stocked, the cooperative movement has also gone out on a limb around food poverty in the UK, particularly school meals, and that whole campaign with Marcus Rashford. And I don't know, you may not know this, has put extra funding into Fairtrade above and beyond being one of the leading retailers of Fairtrade in the first place. So more than £300 million has been pledged to help Fairtrade producers in the global south just deal with the shock of the pandemic. So that sense of leadership, going above and beyond what is necessary, doing what is right, is completely fundamental to the co-op, but it's also fundamental to fair trade. So it feels to me like we are a family. We're doing different aspects of the same thing, but we are very much connected. And I just wanted to say thank you to everybody, to all of you who have been involved in whatever way in these last 12 months, because it's been tough for us all, but goodness me, it would be tougher without the co-op. So I just want to say a huge thank you also on behalf of the Fairtrade producers, who are intimately connected with what you're doing and intimately connected with therefore with us as consumers. I mean, Graham's right. The focus for Fairtrade Fortnight this year has had to completely change because of COVID. So we've had our first virtual Fairtrade Fortnight, and I'm with you, Graham. I think it's actually been a bit of a triumph. I was disappointed not to be able to get out and about, because normally this is the time of the year when I'd be often in different parts of the country meeting people. But actually, we're quite close now, even though IT is not my strong point. And I've been really overwhelmed by the number of people who have joined in. There have been so many events, even when people are a bit zoomed out, so many companies getting involved, so much activity in schools and in Fairtrade towns groups. I mean, it's just been wonderful from that point of view. And I again, that's another glimmer of hope for me in all of the challenging news we hear, is that people really care, and this really matters. I don't know if you're following the news about the British government aid cuts, and the fact that in cutting the aid budget, one of the first programmes the British government is going to cut is humanitarian relief to Yemen, where 80% of the population are in danger of severe hunger. And there's a huge sort of pushback from the NGOs and fair trades involved in that. But the point is, when the thing we're trying to demonstrate to the government on this is actually internationalism, being a good citizen globally, matters to so many people in the UK. And Fairtrade is just an example of that. So really, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to you for everything you're doing, because, as I say, without the co-op, the world would be a poorer place, and we absolutely need that kind of leadership to show us the way. And here's hoping that when we actually get back into, a semblance of normality, that leadership will just go from strength to strength. But it wouldn't be possible without the pioneers and the coordinators and the activists, and that really includes so many of you. I mean, as much as we can be hopeful about fair trade, and we can be hopeful about the fact that the British people get it, and they want to see that spirit of international cooperation. There are enormous challenges, as you know, and that's really what we're trying to highlight in Fairtrade Fortnight. So broadly speaking, and I mean, I know you'll know this, so forgive me for telling you things that you may already have heard, but producers in the Global South are facing a triple whammy. There are three massive punches all at the same time. One is the pandemic. So like us, they have been struggling with the immediate health impacts. They have been struggling with actually the lack of a social safety net. That at least we have a furlough scheme. It's not perfect, but at least it's something. And that's so the immediate impact on health and then their economic welfare is huge. And in Kenya, for example, 80% of the Kenya flour trade, which is mostly an export trade, stopped because of no flights. So what did the plantation owners do? They laid people off. But, you know, it's a fairly obvious and immediate reaction. And what that means, of course, is that people then who are already underpaid, already poor, then struggling with the health emergency and not having any money coming in. So a catastrophic sort of seizure of the sort of economic flows. And so, yes, producers around the world struggling with the pandemic, but without the social safety nets that we have. At the same time, they are also subject, secondly, to just chronic underpayment. You know, hugely exploitative trade in commodities, which goes back to colonialism, where, you know, products are more important than people. Who cares where your banana comes from? It's just a banana. Totally ignoring the people behind the products, the families, the expertise, the welfare, the communities. And that chronic, decades-long underfunding means, generally speaking, there is just no resilience in those supply chains. There is no working capital, no little bit extra saved up. And that's getting worse. Actually, global inequality is increasing, as I'm sure you know. So that second big problem of just chronic poverty engendered by shockingly low prices at the market end. It shows no sign of abating. And then the third whammy, the third punch, is now we all expect them to tackle climate change, to magically become climate resilient, carbon neutral, to leap to the next phase of the global economy. On that basis, it's utterly impossible. So what we're trying to do in Fairtrade Fortnight this year is just sort of push these points together. You know, you are not going to have climate justice without social justice. And also, I mean, the other thing which, I mean, again, forgive me, I know you'll know this because you're part of the family, but the thing which is sort of bizarre to us in Fairtrade is it's so obvious. You know, so you know, Fairtrade involves 1.7 million farmers and workers in 76 countries. Mostly they're smallholders. Mostly they're organising cooperatives, so that sense of community connection is absolutely central. But of course, they're experts in land management, in water usage. They're experts in environmental good practice. They know what they're doing, and we choose to ignore them. You know, one of the little rays of light we've got is we've been able to get a little space in COP26. You know, the intergovernmental climate talks that are happening in Glasgow in November. And we have managed to persuade the British government to have a delegate from Fairtrade in one of the intergovernmental panels. She's called Mary Kinua. She is the chair of Fairtrade Africa, and she works in one of the flour farms in Naivasha in Kenya. She's completely brilliant, really, really strong advocate. But we have had to sort of muscle our way in. And what's interesting is the debates we're seeing in that forum are, you know, men in suits, broadly speaking, because it is mostly men, I'm afraid, and it's mostly middle-aged white men like me in suits, saying really appalling, something must be done, and looking to sort of push the financial impacts and financial sort of, you know, incentives backwards and forwards. And then you had Mary, a Kenyan farmer, saying, hang on a minute, you should be speaking to the farmers. Just stop and make space for that farmer perspective. And there is a really strong business proposition around that. Because if we want to tackle climate change globally, we have to recognize that we need to involve the stewards of the land. And that's as true of farmers in the global north as it is in the global south. So they are, of course, not just managing a cocoa farm or a banana farm. They are also managing a carbon sink. They are also highly skilled at knowing about sequestration, soil management, water management, and I mean, those of you who've been involved with Fairtrade for a while will also know that Fairtrade has for a long time had really rigorous standards of environmental good practice. But these things, they come together, so there is this interlink between sustainability and poverty. You really won't have one without the other. I've seen all kinds of examples, and I've been lucky enough to go and meet producers where pretty much because of poverty, farmers actually toxify their own land. And that's a kind of heartbreaking thing. They might have inherited their land from their grandparents or their great-grandparents, but the cheapest way of tackling pests is to pour cheap toxic chemicals over your soil. And it's kind of heartbreaking to see it because they don't want to do it. But to become more, to run your farm in a more agroecologically balanced way, you need inputs, you need money, you need to invest in better irrigation, you need to invest in setting aside areas of your land to either rotate your crops or create nurseries for seedlings that are more climate resilient. You just need money, you need working capital to put into your farms. So part of our ask to the intergovernmental talks in November, and part of the sort of the campaigning we're going to be sort of leading on, over the next few years, is farmers are our kind of secret weapon in the battle for climate justice and against climate change. They know so much. They are so expert in land use. Let's hear what they need and back them, invest in them, so they can do what they need to do on their farms. And of course, it's not just one smallholder. It's huge cooperatives of smallholders working in tandem. The co-op's been, as I say, a total standout champion of fair trade, and one of the things that this has done has been to enable farmers to be protected from those sort of triple whammy I was describing: pandemic, poverty, and climate change. And there are some fantastic things happening. So one of the things that you'll all know, if you're closely involved with the co-op, is that all of the co-op's cocoa is now fair trade. Everything, not just the chocolate bars, which have been fair trade for years, but even the sprinkles in cakes and the little brown stripes on licorice, all sorts. Everything, all the cocoa used in the co-op is now fair trade. Mostly that comes from Ivory Coast, and I know you'll know this again, but Ivorian farmers are indescribably poor. Typically, they are way below the World Bank definition of absolute extreme poverty. I mean, it is extraordinary. It isn't just a bit poor. They are extremely poor. They are off the scale poor in terms of the World Bank definition. So, according to the World Bank, if you are earning less than $1.90 a day, then you are extremely poor. Forgive me for messing around with my currencies, but if you're an Ivorian woman, and most of the farming in Ivory Coast is done by women, you'll be earning 23p a day. So what's that, about 40 cents or something? Just indescribable. And so how can they possibly be expected to find the investment to become suddenly climate resilient? And at the same time, thinking about it from a sort of a kind of supply chain point of view, one of the things that you need if you're going to grow really good cocoa is you need shade. So the cocoa bushes are quite susceptible to sunburn or frost even at certain times of the year. So you create a canopy of trees above the cocoa bushes, which protects them, creates a microclimate underneath the shade of the trees, prevents the worst excesses of the sun, but creates a kind of a more ambient temperature. So to grow good quality cocoa, farmers need shade trees. Planting trees also increases carbon absorption in the soil. It sequesters all of the good things in the soil nutrients that we need if we're going to have a biodiversity, agroecology in the future. So it's just a win-win, but that just costs money. And one of the things that, because of working with the co-op for so long, we've been able to do in West Africa is help farmers become much more climate resilient. So that, I mean, you'll have heard of the Women's School of Leadership. A team from the Co-op went to go and visit the Women's School of Leadership about 18 months ago, and the Co-op's put extra money in above fair trade prices into this Women's School of Leadership, which is simply an opportunity to get Ivorian women together to share their expertise. Nothing complicated about it, but because it's a patriarchal society, the men tend to own the farms, collect the money, but the women do the work. They weren't being particularly listened to, and this was like a just a light bulb going off, finding a place of safety for women to come together and share their expertise on how you farm cocoa with shifting precipitation patterns, shifting harvest patterns, global fluctuating prices. How do you do that in a resilient way? It's just been absolutely extraordinary. It's just been an amazing success. There are lots of things that have come out of that, but one of them has been there is now an established Ivorian cocoa farming nursery, which is looking at distributing seedlings to the cooperative members of more climate-resistant strains of cocoa, also helping them with productivity, because one of the challenges if you're poor is you don't necessarily have all of the inputs you need to get the maximum productivity out of your bushes. Tackling questions of deforestation as well. I mean, really utterly brilliant stuff. And it's I'm afraid to say, not rocket science. It's a relatively small amount of money from the Co-op, recognizing who the experts are, providing a place of safety for them to come together. And they're doing it for themselves. They're solving it. They are absolutely tackling it. I was able to go to see a cocoa farm a little while ago before lockdown, and it was run on agroecology lines. So a fair trade cocoa farmer, and it was a sort of model farm. So this woman had planted her farm in a way which actually was so completely different from the other farms around. So slash and burn is still a farming technique in Ghana and Ivory Coast. So you are trained 4 years as a farmer. You cut down your crops at the end of the year. You burn the soil to get rid of any pests, and then you plant again. You lose an awful lot in doing that, a lot of nutrients. You also create carbon. So this new technique is a sort of form of dynamic agriculture, where they, in order to sort of manage down pests, they will intercrop. They will plant plants that are sort of sacrificial plants to draw the pests away from the cocoa trees. So when you go to see the farms, it's just like a jungle. Weeds everywhere, all kinds of odd looking things, and you think this doesn't look particularly well managed, but every single plant has been put there for a purpose, and mostly it's to help the cocoa trees grow, and the productivity is immense. And this woman has been doing it for a while. She's now sharing her experience through the Women's School of Leadership with others in the area, and that all just starts because of funding and then recognizing their expertise and allowing that to happen. And I think that is just so thrilling. And if we can roll that out across this community of getting towards 2 million farmers and workers now around the world, we could have this incredible fighting force of experts tackling the climate crisis, which means we manage down the carbon footprint of in the world. We help create livelihoods and welfare in the global south, and we as consumers get to be able to go to our local co-op and buy a good slab of chocolate and enjoy it. It absolutely is a win-win if we get it right. So that's really where I think the Co-op, as I say, has played such a lead role. It isn't just standing by farmers at a minimum level. It's going the extra mile, creating that race to the top. And for that, I think you and all of your colleagues deserve an enormous thanks, because without that kind of leadership, there's a lot of talk about building back better after COVID, but we need people to show us the way. And that's what I think you're doing. And this really matters. It really matters. So a huge thank you. I'm going to stop. Happy to take any questions.
That was brilliant, Mike. Thank you. And we didn't use one of your slides at all.
Well, I just saw I tried to do it, and it wouldn't let me, and I thought rather than making you, Graham, then become Debbie McGee, I just thought I'd just stop and just talk.
Thank you. I don't think we've had any questions through chat, but does anybody have that first question for Mike? Peter, Deb, come on, you're usually the first there.
I've got a question for you, if I can. Can I put a question back to you, which I'd love to hear about? What do you think? or how much do you think people notice fair trade in store and in the kind of co-op community? How relevant is it to them, and what can we do there? Is there something else we could do to sharpen that up?
Would anyone like to answer that?
John.
Peter?
More of what we're doing today, and more directly to members. I mean, it's interesting you talk about the 2 million farmers worldwide. Well, the cooperative group, or the largest of the co-ops in the UK, but not the only one, has around 4 million members. Now, you put the two things together, and you ought to get the potential for an explosion of change. I think one of the benefits of the lockdown has been to emphasize the co-op as a membership organization rather than just a shop. I think that education is something that the co-op has got to go back to. I mean, I'm old enough, as some people will know, to remember when our local co-op had community rooms and a big meeting place, and it was the home of the Workers' Education Association, and there were these kinds of events happening every week for everyone, and the community was much involved in them. We seem to have lost that, but so I think my answer is more of this, and not to be afraid of politicizing with a little p in order to make people aware of these really big political issues.
That's really interesting, Peter. I mean, I agree with you. Actually, broadly speaking, it's a challenge. The thing that we do, and we try hard not to in Fairtrade, but you can see it happening in the kind of wider kind of grocery sector, is people get referred to as consumers. You know, and I mean, I don't define myself as a consumer. I'm a campaigner. I've got values. I feel like I'm not just in a box. And maybe part of the challenge here is not to think about the co-op members or the co-op function as being consumption. You know, I mean, yes, of course, you know, we need to go and buy things, and so I'll choose to go and buy stuff in my local. I live in Suffolk, and the East of England Co-op is my local co-op provider. And you know, yes, I go and shop there, but actually, it's much more than just that, isn't it? So that sense of what membership means, you know, active, engaged, educated in membership, I think is really important. Couple of things thoughts about what we might do about that. One is we've been in the past, we've been invited to the co-op AGMs in Manchester, and one of the things that I think has really sort of kick-started this sort of deeper relationship that we've got with the co-op recently has been member resolutions, where the members have challenged the co-op executive just to do more, you know, to pick up on fair trade and to do more with it. And that has been fabulously helpful in terms of just getting attention and galvanizing what was already there and making more of them. And the second thing is we would love to campaign more together. Your point about, you know, the millions of members here, and then the millions in cooperatives in the fair trade system sort of globally. And one of the things that we are looking actively to do now is to create a climate justice campaign involving producers as well as those of us in the global north who buy these products. And we're working with Fairtrade Africa now because of all of the injustices I've described and the sense of this being a missed opportunity. We're starting to create a campaign now for ahead of COP in November, which is to say to governments around the world, farmers have got a role here, and they are not just the ones who are most impacted, because of course they are, as we know, but they've also got a role as you know, as champions in the fight against the climate crisis. So maybe part of what we can do there is to link up farmers with co-op members, so we end up having a multi-million large body of campaigners. So you're not a consumer or a producer, you're a campaigner, you're calling for a better world, and there's a huge opportunity there for us to work together.
Yeah, brilliant stuff. Deb, you had your hand up for a long while.
I did, yeah. Hi, Michael.
Hi,
we follow each other on
That's right.
Twitter. So yeah, it's good to see you in person. I joined the co-op nearly 10 years ago. My background is in campaigning anyway. For anybody that knows me, it's, you know, I'm forever stamping my feet about something. It was one of the things that attracted me to the co-op. As a retailer, we weren't afraid to stamp our feet and shout. And I think that the fair trade position was very different then. The co-op led the way in campaigning. The other big retailers saw that there was a sort of monetary opportunity there as well, so they jumped and joined the bandwagon as well. Regarding price, fair trade goods are very comparable to the general market as well. So it is about, how do we get the message out to, we all know our fair trade supporters. I would hope that every co-op member is a fair trade supporter. How do we get it out beyond that sort of easy reach, as it were? One thing that I've thought about a lot over the past couple of months, especially during COVID, here in Wales, we've got lots of small-scale producers, and a lot are starting up producing chocolate. We've got a wonderful Anglesey at the moment. We've got Cocoa Pizzazz down here, in sort of 2 miles down the road in Caersus. What I'm not seeing is they're not using fair trade. There's also sort of coffee roasters as well setting up that they're not using fair trade. So how can we persuade them to use fair trade? And again, that's a sort of marketing bonus for them.
Really good questions. Thanks so much, Deb. It's good to see you. And there are a couple of other questions about this in the chat. I mean, absolutely, what we need to do is to widen out the kind of the movement to include those who may not sort of feel like they're hardcore campaigners or long-standing supporters, because there really is a role for everyone. And also, you look at any social movement that's succeeded in the past. You only get successful. You only achieve your objectives if you involve, the unusual parts of society. There are a number of ways in which I think we need to do this. One of them is there was a question in the chat about price points and the assumption that fair trade's some kind of middle class kind of proposition. We really need to tackle that. So again, what the co-op has done there on pricing, for example, is incredibly important. It would have been possible to see co-op prices for fair trade bananas being higher, because it is expensive to make sure that you're supporting the value chain in the way you need to. So the co-op has chosen not to do that, and that's really, really, really important. And then we have fantastic partnerships with businesses like Greggs, and Greggs do a brilliant job with fair trade. All of their coffee and their orange juice and lots of their products are fair trade, and they're at a different price point again. So Greggs is now the third biggest food to go retailer, a place to go and get a cup of coffee particularly, but they are the cheapest. So you can get a fair trade coffee at Greggs more cheaply than you can get a non-fair trade coffee at McDonald's or Costa. And that plays to a completely different demographic. We need more businesses like that can sort of take us to different parts of the country, different demographics. It's really important. And then in terms of things like your artisan chocolatiers, it's the same thing with coffee. There's quite a big market now, quite a big movement for sort of direct trade. So a small brand here working with a small producer group overseas and directly bringing in the beans, maybe doing their own grinding or their own roasting or whatever else. It's quite hard for us to get into that sort of sector for a couple of reasons. First off, they're quite small volumes quite often, and sometimes they will move from one producer group to another because part of their business model is new flavor for this season, seasonal variations in recipe formulation, and they buy a bit from here and a bit from there. So it's actually not vastly helpful always to the farming groups, because what they need is what they have with the mainstream co-op is predictable long-term relationships based on minimum volume forecasts. And because Fairtrade has a baked-in minimum price and then a premium on top, as you know, that gives them the financial opportunity to plan and invest in their farms. So some direct trade can be a little bit here today and gone tomorrow. It doesn't mean that there's bad intentions. I just mean from the farming point of view, it's not necessarily all that it's cracked up to be. But I would love to see a sort of common cause there. And maybe that's more about communications, joint campaigning, rather than becoming Fairtrade certified, which is to say, farmers are important. Here's what's going on the farms. Here's how we can all help them, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. So does that economic impact, like that, selling more at lower prices, does that have a really positive direct impact on farmers, Fairtrade farmers? Does that translate into better income for Fairtrade farmers?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, the important thing, I know most of you will know this, but if anyone is in any doubt, Fairtrade is all about financial clarity to farmers. So regardless of what price the supermarket will charge for a product, the farmer will get a minimum price, absolutely guaranteed, and we check that robustly. And there'll be a minimum price that goes to the farmer, and then there will be a committee premium on top, which goes to their cooperative committee, their premium committee, and it's roughly speaking about 10% extra. So the money comes to you as a minimum price to the farmer. Your community gets a bonus of around about 10%, and that's what the community is used for investing in schools and hospitals and so on. The interesting thing is whether retailers choose to pass that price point on to the consumers or not. And the co-op, as I say, has been sort of standout leading here, which is to say the cocoa commitment. All cocoa, I mean, it's a phenomenal commitment because it's complex to do. Even the cocoa that goes into the batter, that surrounds cod, it's all fair trade. Now that involves the co-op in spending more than it might, in inverted commas, need to, but not passing that on to the consumers is an incredibly important part of the co-op's leadership. But also it allows consumers to come in. It would be a really, really big backward step for the fair trade movement if fair trade was so expensive that only a few people could afford to buy it. Farmers don't need that. Farmers need scale. That's why we work with big companies, because they need to be able to sell as much of their volume on fair trade terms as possible in order to be able to build that future that we all want to see them happen.
Ailsa, is there anything else on chat that we should be aware of?
So there's some great comments coming in on the chat and thoughts from people on the call. I don't know if everybody can see them and read through them rather than questions. I think they're comments and thoughts. But if anybody wants to pose any particular part of that to Mike, then do you want to come off mute? Just pop your hand up, your electronic hand, and we can come to you.
I can speak to the question about fairly traded, if you like, while that's happening. So one of the things that we've seen in the last couple of years is companies sort of doing their own thing, thinking that fair trade's a good idea, but wanting to make their own version of it. And we take a view in fair trade that we want to see all companies. We want to see a sort of rising of standards, right? So we want to see that race to the top, and we will work with companies who want to try and get there, even if they don't really want to do it the fair trade way, provided farmers want it. Provided it seems like it's a way for farmers of getting ahead. And that's complex for us as campaigners and consumers, because it's much easier to say, just look for the fair trade mark. But sometimes companies want to do their own thing. And there's then a huge variety. We speak to these companies all the time. Sometimes they want to do it in the right way. Sometimes I'm afraid it's a bit cynical. So you'll know that we no longer work with Nestle. Nestle used to certify Kit Kat. They wanted to fold it into their own cocoa buying scheme, and frankly, there just wasn't anything in it for the farmers. We spoke to the Ivorian farmers, and it's just corporate philanthropy. Some nice projects on top, but it sort of rips the heart out of fair trade, which is that sense of voice and value. The extra money they get and the empowerment they get. So that was very clear. With Sainsbury's, which is, I think the point here about fairly traded, Sainsbury's created a pilot for fairly traded tea, which we didn't agree with. It's a matter of record. That was in 2017. To their credit, they said at the time that they would remain the largest retailer of fair trade in the world, and they are still. They still do, all of their bananas are fair trade and lots of other things as well. And it looks to me like they're not going to progress their tea pilot. So my hope is at some point, that we can find a way of working with them again on tea, because one of the things they discovered is
you want to want a sandwich, Evan?
You'll know this because of you're intimately involved with the fair trade movement. But one of the things I think the Sainsbury tea pilot has discovered is it takes a lot of money to run your own scheme, and you need to find a way of farmers feeling they have ownership of it. And if farmers It's hard for farmers to feel they own a scheme which is set up by a supermarket thousands of miles away. And of course, the fair trade is co-owned by the farmers. It's a completely different starting point. So my hope is that we can find a way of working with Sainsbury's again, because, as I say, farmers need scale. But they, and I think my hope would be we'd end up with a sort of fair trade market which has room for, a large number of players, the kind of scale you will get from someone like Sainsbury's, but then the kind of extraordinary leadership you get from the co-op. We really need both of those aspects to sort of raise the game for people.
Okay, Tracy, you had your hand up for a second there. Was that a question or by accident?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind saying something. I've been watching the news and I find it very stressful when you see the children in Yemen, how they suffer, which is really, really heartbreaking. And also with farmers as well, if their children see that their parents are not making anything from these their crop, then it's the children that are going to decide not to carry on with the family life as well. So fair trade is really important, that they get the cost for what they produce, you know what I mean? So yes, that's what I wanted to say.
Tracy, I couldn't agree more. It's the what's going on in Yemen is heartbreaking, but it also makes me really angry. We've written to the British government today about their cutting of the aid budget to Yemen just when they need it most. It is appalling, and I think it'll be really unpopular. And my hope is it will sort of galvanise the public opinion a little bit, just in defence of the aid budget. So there is all of this sort of very legitimate point about, should we be spending money overseas while we're trying to sort ourselves out at home? I totally get that. But the cuts to the aid budget were about £4 billion, and the British government managed to find an extra £4 billion for our defence budget. So there's something not right there, and not particularly moral, and we need to have that conversation. Meanwhile, if I can just offer one small piece of, or maybe two small bits of of hope. First is there are a lot of people who feel like you, so let's not ever be put off by this. Those of us who care need to speak out. But secondly, what you're doing with Fairtrade makes such a massive difference. I a few years ago went to Colombia, and I met banana farmers in the kind of banana growing region of Colombia, which was also the area of Colombia where drugs wars were common in the sort of 80s through to the sort of noughties, and the kids were, they just had the most awful life chances, no school, and they were, an awful lot of them, forced into being gun runners for drugs gangs, they had very little chance of any other way of life, and they would get American dollars in cash for gun running and drug running. So that was your way out of your abject poverty. Fast forward a few years, there are 14 fair trade cooperatives who have collaborated on, at the time I went there, they were just opening a really big secondary school. Previously, if any of the kids went to school at all, it was in a pigsty, literally a pigsty. So in the rainy times, they could be under the shelter and sitting amongst the pig manure. And they just built with Fairtrade Premium this school, 14 groups coming together. And the kids were just brilliant. One of them was training to become an accountant. It was just fabulous. They were on their way. And that's because of what you guys do and what others of us do in the movement about encouraging people to buy fair trade. You can make an extraordinary difference just through the way you shop.
That's brilliant, Mike. I think that's a great comment, really, to end on. And if I could just pick up on a point that Deb has made in chat as well there, talking about that she still retains a fair trade friend, really. I think that's been a point that all of us can say this year. I think, even moving to online meetings like this, we've been able to meet some fair trade friends. So it would be great if that continues. Personally, I've found your talk fascinating, informative, passionate and inspirational, and as I guess most people here have. I love that bit about recognising the importance of fair trade farmers, and it would be great to think that perhaps in future we could be meeting fair trade farmers and making friends with them in some other kind of professional way like this as well. That would be absolutely fabulous. So if there are no other questions, I think I'm going to call this meeting to an end with a huge thanks. And thanks for your kind and encouraging words about the co-op as well. I'm sure that's really appreciated as well. So if I can bring this to an end with a virtual round of applause and just say, Mike, thank you very much, and I hope it's not long before we meet again.
Really, what you're doing is so inspiring. I really mean it. It gives me so much hope. So part of the point of Fairtrade Fortnight is for us to meet up with like-minded people, right? And know that we're not we're not alone. There are lots of us who feel this way. So wrote me if I can help.
You've got a lot of friends here.
Your point about getting together more with farmers is something we're already looking at, because it seems to be going really well. And it doesn't matter if Zoom doesn't particularly work well. It's a chance to get together, and that is just so important. And I think lots of the farming groups want to do it too. So watch this space.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mike. And I hope it's not long before we can see you again, and it's not too long before you can get to see some producers in real life as well.
Oh, fingers crossed. Take care, everyone. Keep safe.
Thank you. Bye bye then.